Yes, a very good morning to you. It's Friday, the 24th of July, 2020. My name's Pete Fairbairn, and I'm the host of the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. Great to have your company. We're going to run through 5 of the biggest stories making waves in the world of sport this morning. And as always, I'm joined by one of Australia's top journalists. And this fella, regular contributor to the show, Julian De Stoop, has been at me for weeks to get this young man on to join me. So I'm really pleased to have Courtney Walsh from The Australian on the show for the first time. How are you, Courtney?
Yeah, very good, Pete, and that's very generous to call me young. And a couple of years on Jules, so he's clearly pumped me up well.
He has indeed, mate. No, fantastic to have you on. Of course, Courtney, one of Australia's preeminent AFL and tennis riders, but we're going to talk about other topics today as well. We will start with the footy, though, Courtney, and down your way in Melbourne, article from Sam McClure in The Age. He's looking at the salary cap squeeze, which could force some GWS Giants stars out of their squad at the end of the year. We know Jeremy Cameron, of course, is off contract, but has essentially recommitted. And industry sources, according to McClure's article, are saying that they fear free agent Zach Williams may leave the GWS Giants at the end of 2020. And interestingly as well, rival clubs believe that the gun midfielder Josh Kelly is once again gettable due to the Giants' financial predicament. I want to talk a little bit about that, Courtney. Should the Giants actually consider trading Josh Kelly in order to keep Zach Williams and in doing so retain better control over their salary cap, especially with list sizes, salary caps still not confirmed beyond this year?
It's a really interesting question, and there's a fascinating read this morning from Sam. Josh was clearly courted heavily by North Melbourne a couple of years ago. His father had played for North Melbourne. The money that was thrown around was significant, and he really was arguably in the top 3 or 4 players in the competition at the time. This year, there are some concerns he's not going as well, similar to his club. I'd be reluctant to rule a line through the Giants or Josh in terms of finding his best. And Zach Williams, as we know, is a very, very, very valuable player. So it depends on what you value the most. Do you like that drive off half back, or do you want your person in the midfield with the classy skills of Kelly? The commitment that he made a couple of years ago, Josh, struck me as he's a captain in waiting at the Giants. Now, they've got a few of those around. Cornelio's taken over at the moment. I'd be very surprised if he's to go. Obviously, he's not playing quite at his best, but I'd be very surprised if he's the man to go. Zach Williams is a fantastic player. I'm sure they'll do everything they can to try and keep him, but it's a natural thing in the salary cap era for players to be squeezed out. We've seen it at other clubs. The Giants clearly top heavy on talent with some really, really good young players like Jacob Hopper, Tim Taranto, even this year's draftees, Tom Green, for example, will be demanding more in coming years. So, I can see, I would think it'd be Zach if somebody's to be squeezed out.
We move from the Giants to their opponents in tonight's grand final replay, Richmond. And I'm going to throw some names at you. David Asprey, Josh Caddy, Trent Cotchin, Shane Edwards, Brendan Ellis, Batcher Hooley, Toby Nankervis, Dion Prestia. So that's more than a third of the players from last year's AFL Grand Final premiership winning Richmond team who won't be in action tonight as Richmond take on GWS. A variety of different reasons, from injury to obviously Ellis moving to the Gold Coast and a couple of the men there who didn't go up to the Queensland hub for personal reasons. That being said, we've seen a Richmond team who has been able to embrace that next man in mentality. Jake Arts, Noah Bolter, maybe a Chol, Derek Egmales-Smith, Jack Graham, Jack Higgins, Camden McIntosh, Patrick Naish are the 8 in the team tonight who didn't play last year. And Mitch Cleary's done a fantastic piece where he's looked into maybe a Chol, what he did in pre-season to get himself into that best 22 conversation. He's looked at Jake Arts and how he has managed to hang on to his place on the list at the end of last year and break through for his debut this year. Courtney, I want to ask, because Richmond's kind of next man up mentality, has that got them poised to look for a third flag in 4 seasons?
Oh, look, I think the depth that Richmond has is incredible, and it was clearly on display last year in the grand final. They won the VFL grand final the week before, and they played, the talent that was running around in that grand final was significant, and they actually had a couple of players out that were held over for the grand final that didn't play in that VFL team. So you knew that they had a number of players that could come in. Mitch's piece was really a fascinating read. I know those sand dunes that maybe your troll ran up in Warrnambool. It's a really nice little colourful scene that he's painted there. Chol's been really, really good. I'm impressed with his agility. the fact that he presses forward. They're three ruckmen. I mean, effectively, Soldo, Nankervis, and Joel, they have three different varieties. Nankervis is superb behind the ball. Soldo, more traditional, like his cult figure cousin Ivan Marek was. And then you've got Joel, who I think is a really dynamic, agile footballer who I think, in coming years could well become one of the leading ruckmen. I think they've got great depth there. Tonight's a fascinating match against the Giants. I would be, as I said, reluctant before to write the Giants off. I'm also not yet convinced about Richmond. Their 3 wins have been really good in the last 3 weeks, but the teams that they've played have not been those that we think will be contending. So I think tonight's a real test. But the players they've got coming in, Arts has been really good. Egil Messi-Smith, driving from Wentworth to Bendigo. I had an old friend, Richie Vandenberg, a Hawthorn captain, who had to do the same thing. It's a 3-hour drive for training when he was a youngster. So to see where he's come to, it talks about the professionalism in that piece, that he's becoming more and more professional in the hub. That's another interesting side point. I think that some players will revel in the hub opportunity, the hands-on commitment they get. So positive steps in the last 3 weeks for Richmond. Really good to see the great young depth. Be fascinating to see what happens tonight.
Yeah, very well said. And of course, we've seen guys like Anthony Miles, Jacob Townsend squeezed out of that Richmond list in recent years as well. Obviously, the retirement of Alex Rance as well. But I suppose a strong culture at a club and a winning culture has a way of holding on to people who put the side before themselves and want to hang around, even if they're not guaranteed selection, perhaps leading to that depth. Our big story today that we're going to spend a little bit more time on comes from friend of the show, Julian Linden, in the Daily Telegraph. It's a great interview with Cate Campbell, I guess the face of the Australian Olympic team in recent years. And it's a rallying call from Cate to Australia's Olympians as we're 1 year out from the Tokyo Olympics, of course, rearranged due to COVID. I guess I want to start, Courtney, by looking at the current situation, the current state of play in Tokyo. Do you anticipate that we're going to see the Tokyo Olympic Games held in 12 months' time?
I certainly hope so. I did read with some alarm today that there is a spike, and it's probably the most significant spike they've had in their second wave of COVID-19. I was there in March in Japan, in Tokyo, and obviously the preparations were going ahead at that stage, and people were hoping that it would go ahead. So I really hope for the money that's been invested, but also for the athletes that 2021 takes off. Really interesting piece by Jules. Shout out to him. Congratulations on being nominated for the Kennedys. We own some trotters together, Jules and I, and have had too many late night whiskies in New York through US Open. So he's a great fellow, Jules Linden. The piece on Cate was really, really strong. If we remember the fantastic photo when we first learnt that the Olympics were going to be cancelled, there was Cate standing with her sister on the rocks, I think in Sydney. So she talks about how she's monitored her training, what she's done. You can't go too hard because she was planning to peak right now, but now her best form has to be 12 months down the track. So you need to conserve some energy. I've spoken to a few athletes in the similar vein. Ash Barty and her camp have been trying to weigh up the balance of, she's really keen to win gold next year. It's the thing that's really driving her as well. How do you best prepare when your sport's not on, or when the main goal is 12 months away? It's a fascinating thing for athletes. I think Cate delves into it well there, but you can't go too hard, but you can't walk away and leave a little bit you need to be keeping yourself in some decent shape. I think Ash Barty is hitting 3 days a week, not going to 5 or 6. She's just hitting 3 days a week, doing some other I suppose some weights and some lighter training like that. Cate, not getting into the pool too much. You need to be, I suppose, in reasonable shape, but preparing mentally and physically for the next 12 months with the uncertainty that's ahead, not knowing necessarily whether that will go ahead. It's a fascinating time for athletes, and I'll be fascinated to see what happens in Tokyo.
Yeah, and of course, Cate Campbell looking for her 4th Olympic Games. There'll be some people who, whether it's dependent on the sport they're in, whether it's dependent on the level they're at, whether it's dependent on a range of things, who are looking for their one and only Olympic Games, and be extremely nerve-wracking, I would have thought, for those people. You look at sports like gymnastics, for example, where traditionally competitors are quite young, and as they grow older and taller and they become less likely to be selected for an Olympic Games, things like that. I guess one of the other questions I wanted to ask on this one is, could we see the IOC, or do we know whether they're already exploring the idea of different events taking place in different countries around the world? So taking advantage of countries who have managed to lock down pretty well against the virus, and potentially sending different sports into different places outside of Japan.
It's a very good question. Look, I've got to say it's one that I'm not certain of myself, but I think that would be remiss not to, given different countries will be in different situations. And we knew already with Tokyo that they'd been planning to have events around Japan. They initially, when they first said everything was going to be in Tokyo itself, but as the planning went on, they realised that, for example, the marathon needed to be shifted to a climate where it was feasible to run it, as opposed to stifling hot conditions. A few other sports had been moved out of the centre of Tokyo and spread around Japan, and that's not uncommon for Olympic nations. So I think it would be remiss not to do that. Let's hope, though, that they can have the whole event.
Yeah, well said. We move to our penultimate story for the day, and it is in the world of tennis. It comes from Christopher Clarey in the New York Times. He explores the fact that female tennis player Danielle Collins, I should say, has been ejected from the World Team Tennis competition. It's a mixed tennis competition taking place in the US, very strict guidelines around where athletes could go and what they could do. However, Collins leaving, returning to her home state, and in doing so, breaching the league's health and safety protocols, and instantly being kicked out of that competition. Courtney, you know a lot more about this space than I do, but does this episode show how realistic it is, how unrealistic, I should say, it is to expect the US Open to proceed in 6 weeks' time when you're looking at, kind of close to 300 athletes all having to adhere to such strict guidelines, and the consequences if even just one of them were to break it?
The consequences would be significant if one of them was to break it and then infect the rest of, even one competitor. That throws off the legitimacy, I think, of the tournament. So it's a real concern. Danielle, an Australian Open semi-finalist last year, so clearly a very, very, very good player. She's battling arthritis, so her excuse was that she was driving to get some medication 2 hours away. It's a long drive, but admittedly, from if you're battling a condition, you need to do that. The broader story about the US Open, I think, is really interesting. They've announced overnight they've moved the hotel. Initially, the players were going to be in a bubble at JFK Airport, which I think would have been a nightmare. They're now a little further out on Long Island, sort of Garden City, and a little further out. So they'll be coming in the other way from normal. They'll be coming in the Long Island Express from Long Island instead of going out from Manhattan. My understanding is they've got a traffic light system, red light, amber light, green light, and that a couple of weeks ago it had gone back to amber light, which was high alert that it may not go ahead. I think it's been switched back to green in the last week, so that surprises me somewhat. They're very confident about going ahead. The bubble will be fascinating. Danielle, I think, had been so critical of Novak Djokovic, and so then find herself in a similar situation where she's the first, I suppose, woman to be to breach the rules. I think surprising. But the organisers are confident with how it's worked. No positive tests so far, and they're getting through. So I think they're confident they'll go ahead.
Really quickly on that one, we know that there's a lot of big-name players who haven't committed to playing in the Open. Do you think we'll see, if it does proceed, do you think we'll see a lot of those big names on both the men's and women's side of the draw elect not to participate?
I do. I think there'll be a couple of high-profile Australians that won't go to the US, and I think I doubt we'll see Nadal there as a defending champion. I'd be very surprised if he's there.
Our final story today, sorry, Courtney, I'll keep moving here. Our final story today, we almost managed to go through a week without talking about the Brisbane Broncos, but with them back on the primetime stage tonight against just the Melbourne Storm, nothing too hard, of course, there. It's a great piece by your colleague Will Swanson in The Australian, where he calls it the nightmare on Caxton Street. Some quotes from Joe Ofahengawi from the Broncos around their mental state, where they're at, how they're able to turn up to training every day with a smile on their face ahead of such a huge game. We know during the week that at the Brisbane Broncos board meeting that it's essentially been ratified, formally or otherwise, that head coach Anthony Seibold needs to win 5 of his next 10 matches to retain his job beyond this year. That's despite having another 3.5 years left on his contract. They've committed to Seibold for the next 10 matches. But if they're thrashed again over the next couple of weeks, like they have been by the by the Titans, by the West Tigers last week, they've had some heavy, heavy losses. If they're thrashed again against the Storm tonight, and then they've got Cronulla, South Sydney, Canberra in the weeks to come, does that 5 from 10 go out the window?
It was a very strong commitment, but there is a saying that when you're backed, that's when you're most at threat in long-term stay in coaching. The way Will painted that, of looking at seeing Seibold, the camera's panning to him in the coaching box. He's devoid of answers, looking unsure, lost, confused in the box. I think it's a really concerning time, obviously, for the Broncos, particularly the time when the football AFL is going so well. They need to be, they would love to be firing the Broncos. 3-7. I suppose if he wins 5, that takes it to 8-12. I can absolutely see why they would say, well, if you can do that, you hold on. And hopefully it's a step forward. But the way they're playing and the way they've performed in the last couple of weeks scarcely suggests that it's possible. I noticed, $1.06 versus $8 against Melbourne. You'd think the Storm will be far too strong, and that's another really devastating blow. Yeah,
$1.06, certainly the shortest any opponent's ever been against the proud football club that is the Brisbane Broncos. Courtney, that's all we've got time for this morning. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it and love to have you back again.
Thanks so much for having me, Pete, and have a great day up in Brisbane.
Appreciate it, mate. That's the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff, all wrapped up for the week. You can catch it Facebook, YouTube, Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We'll see you on Monday with ESPN's Sam Bruce.